All right. If he is available, I'm going to ask Andrew King to come on. If not, we will. Yes. Hello, Dr. King. How are you tonight?
Hey, brother. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, great to be with you too. Now, we used to be able to be together in the same room, and then you decided to go and move to a different kingdom post at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. And I haven't heard that that's gone terrible for you, so I'm glad that it's going well.
Well, we're thankful to be here. And Dr. Allen, our president, was on earlier, and he was smiling, so it can't all be that bad.
That's awesome. Well, we do miss you around the parts of Louisville and your precious family. Let me introduce you real quick to those who may not be familiar with you. Dr. Andrew King serves as Assistant Professor of Biblical Studies at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary and Spurgeon College. He has actually been with Speak for the Unborn since nearly the beginning. He previously served as our Executive Director and then transitioned to the President of the Board when he moved out to Midwestern. So thanks again for being a part of this tonight, Andrew. And is there anything you'd like to add to that?
I'm just so encouraged by this event. I've been popping in and out like everybody else, and just being just wowed by the encouragement, the stories, the testimonies that have been shared. I'm just reinvigorated for my love for what this ministry does, and just hearing all the ways that the Lord has been working through this ministry. It's just incredible. So yeah, my family has just been blessed to be just a small part of what the Lord has done through Speak for the Unborn. And we're really thankful for the leadership, and it's still an honor to serve with this ministry.
All right, so let's just jump right into some meaty questions for you. So you are an Old Testament scholar, and we would love to know from you, what is the contribution of the Old Testament to a Christian understanding of pro-life advocacy?
Yeah, such a good question, and an important question, right? So when we look at our Bibles, the 2/3 of it that we sometimes skip over quickly to get to the real stuff, that's part of Christian scripture, I would argue. And Paul says that all of that was written for our instruction. So when we're thinking about any issue, seeing what God's revelation from beginning to end is really important. So there's a couple of different ways that we could answer this. I think Dr. Aiken did a great job pointing to some of the key specific texts that we would turn to uphold a view of the sanctity of life. So what I'll do is I'll kind of look at three different things that I think are helpful from an Old Testament perspective. Particularly Old Testament is Christian scripture. So the first thing I'd point out is the unique status and commission of humanity in Genesis 1. And it really reminds us in this discussion of what we're fighting for specifically. So in the ancient world, around the time that Genesis, maybe a little bit before when Genesis was written, there were a lot of different views for how the creation of humanity, how that played out and what it was for, and all this. And one of the accounts that we have basically frames the creation of humanity as a labor force. So the gods got tired, it's a polytheistic worldview. So the lesser gods were, doing all the grunt work, and they get tired. So they say, all right, well, we'll just create people who can do all the manual labor, and then maybe we can get a break. So people are basically created for the maintenance of the world. They're basically, just chaperones of, they're janitors is how they're created. And I would argue that this is the way that people are often viewed today as well. Where we often can assess the value of people insofar as they are useful to us. So that's a very relevant point for the sanctity of life. But though this may have been a popular conception then and now, the book of Genesis will have none of it. We see the creation of humanity in the book of Genesis holding out a quite opposite view, this elevated status for humanity. And we see this in a couple of ways from the biblical text. So the other creation days of the creation week, God is simply speaking, and then creation is coming into existence. So he says, let there be light, and it happens. And he's speaking, and then it's happening. But on the sixth day, after the creation of animals, things slow down a little bit in Genesis 1:26. And we hear God say something, kind of declaring what he's going to do. And he says, let us make man in our own image. So what's unique is the creation of man in the image of God. Now, there's different views on what exactly that means, whether it's a cognitive ability or whether it's something functional. But regardless of whatever view that you take, the point is that humanity is distinct from everything else that's been created. So there's a certain status that people have by virtue of being made in or as the image of God. And I would argue that there are royal overtones to that as well, where Adam is presented as a kingly kind of figure. So man and woman are made in the image of God, male and female. He created them in the image of God, and he gives them something to do. So unlike the other creation accounts from the ancient world, humanity isn't created to do grunt work and to be servants, but in Genesis 1:28, it says that God blessed them. So he's going to give them something to do, but it's framed as a blessing for them. So it's not servitude, it's a blessing. And he tells them to be fruitful, to multiply, to fill the earth, and to subdue it, to exercise dominion over it. In Genesis 2:15, Adam is told to work and to keep the Garden of Eden. So that's language that actually gets used later in the book of Numbers and other places for what priests do in the temple. So we have Adam kind of framed as this king and this priest together. So together, basically humanity is to fill the earth with image bearers, to spread abroad the reign of God to the ends of the earth, bringing all things under his righteous rule and his reign. So we see this elevated status of humanity really partnering with God and expanding God's fame all over the face of the planet, to expand Eden to the ends of the earth. And we see that after the creation of humanity, whereas we've seen this refrain in Genesis, if you read through it, you'll see over and over again, it says after each creation day that it's good, it was good, it was good. At the end of the sixth day of creation, after the creation of humanity, when everything is properly ordered, God says, hey, that is very good. So in all of this, we see that there's a real value to human beings being made in the image of God, giving a royal and priestly task to do, that they're valued in a very unique way. They're expanding the mission of God in the world. So we see great value for every human being that is created in God's image. But right after Genesis 3, we know the story. The humans rebel against God, and they sin, and sin enters the world, and we see the effects and ruin that sin brings into the world. So in Genesis 4, we see this manifest, I think, in a very interesting way as it relates to this conversation. Cain, in jealousy of his brother Abel, murders him. So Cain murders Abel. He does it in secret, and then when God questions him about it, he tries to normalize and justify his behavior. God says, hey, where's Cain? And he's like, I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? What a response, right? So in a very real way, we see Cain seeking to work against the commission for which God has created humanity, to spread his fame across the face of the earth. They were called to be fruitful and to multiply. And instead of being fruitful and multiplying, Cain actually kills somebody and is working against the creation mandate. He, it turns out, is like his father, the serpent, who Jesus says in John 8 was a murderer from the beginning. So just one little snippet there that I think relates to the Old Testament's contribution to our understanding of pro-life advocacy, that we can see that though doubtlessly there are different and many heartbreaking factors and considerations in the lives of women and family as they're pursuing abortion, we need to realize that the ethos of abortion is much like what was going on with Cain. That the ethos of abortion is to work to undo the very good creation that God has made. It is to reject the global fame of God and to seek to normalize what God says is evil. And Paul says that since they didn't see fit to acknowledge God, that he'd given them over to all manners of unrighteousness, including envy, murder, strife, and deceit. Which, if you serve in pro-life ministry in any way, shape, or form, you'll see each of those things played out in different ways. But the gospel shows us a better way. That though the serpent has come to steal, to kill, and destroy, Jesus, the true and better Adam, the one who shows us what it really means to be human, comes to give life. That through his perfect life, death, and resurrection, he crushes the head of the serpent as God promised, and he is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to him. And he saves them and he sends them out. He sends them to proclaim the reign of God in every nation and every neighborhood to the ends of the earth. And as Hebrews 12 says, Jesus's blood speaks a better word than Abel's. So we can see this from the very beginning, God working out his purpose for life and humanity and the effects of sin, and really how the mission of God is pushing back against that. So we see his commission get worked out in many different ways throughout the rest of the Old Testament. With Abraham, he's promised that all the nations of the earth would be blessed through him. Offspring is a big deal for Abraham, and ultimately we see it in the promised new covenant, where every person, regardless, least to the greatest, they will all receive new hearts and be filled with the very Spirit of God. So the first way is just the trajectory of Scripture from the very opening passages. The second thing that I would point to briefly is the way that Old Testament law explicitly condemns the mistreatment and oppression of vulnerable groups in the midst of Israel. So you'll see terms in the Old Testament law codes that mention things like orphans and the fatherless and the sojourner, and then often and sometimes the Levite. So these were kind of categories of people who in Israel's day, they couldn't really provide for themselves for one reason or another. In the case of the Levites, God says, hey, I'm ordering the whole thing. So they don't, they're not working for their own stuff, but they are dependent on the nation as a whole to care for them. And orphans and widows and the sojourner obviously don't have viable means to care for themselves. But these are people that many modern people would look at today and say, well, they're a real drain on society. They're really just pulling this whole thing down. They're not contributing. But God says, hey, you're not only to not oppress them, you're not only to actively harm them, but you are to actively care for them. And in doing this, Israel reflects the very character of God. So in Deuteronomy 10, it defines God as one who executes justice for the fatherless and the widow, and loves the sojourner and gives them food. And then he says, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. So care for the vulnerable isn't something peripheral to what it means to be the people of God. It's very central to their identity as they're imaging their God. And as one scholar has said, God is an Exodus kind of God, and we should be an Exodus kind of people. So for Christians, because they have received mercy, the mercy of God through Christ for the forgiveness of sins, the ultimate debt being paid, the ultimate mercy shown, we should be a people who by nature are merciful to others. So that's James 1:27. Kind of stakes the validity of a whole Christian's religious profession on, are they caring for orphans or widows in their distress and keeping themselves undefiled from the world. So one last thing on this, just very briefly, I think the Old Testament is very helpful also in reminding us of where our hope should be placed. right? So you read through the Old Testament and you see a lot of names of kings, and they come and then they go. And a lot of names of kings who are popping up, and I think that is to tell us you can't place your hope in governments, right? So you have a good king one moment, and within a generation, you have a king who is described as being the most wicked of all kings, like, ever. So our ultimate hope can't be placed in governments or leaders or anything like that. Our ultimate hope must be placed in God, who's fulfilling his sovereign purposes, even when we don't understand what he's doing. So like Daniel and his friends, who could have very easily justified kind of selling out in a foreign place in Babylon and just going along to, maybe even with good intentions, to kind of ascend the ranks so they can, be a good witness, to the people in power. They said, we're not going to do that. We're going to be faithful to God, and we're not going to sell out. And they remained faithful even when it seemed counterintuitive. They put their hope not in the pragmatic potential of government, but rather in the power of God. So God often reduces the size of the army so he gets all the glory. So that's really helpful, I think, for us to understand as we think through the issue of the sanctity of life.
Yeah, well, thank you for drawing some of those things out. That was actually really powerful. Thank you for that. You mentioned the power of God over the pragmatic of government. And one of the things that is just everybody's talking about today, regardless if it's news or social media, water cooler talk, the issue of racial justice and racial reconciliation, they're huge topics. How should we understand the connection between racial reconciliation and pro-life advocacy?
Yeah, that's such an important question, and it's a very good question. It can be easy, in one sense, to kind of compartmentalize the sanctity of life issues that we feel more comfortable with, or that are more tangible kind of things, and separate those from the ones that maybe seem less relevant to me, or the ones that I feel less comfortable with for whatever reason. But I would argue that the vision of God's work in the world, that starts with the creation of humanity, being fruitful, multiplying, filling the earth with the reign of God, through the gospel. Now, the gospel that, as Paul says in Galatians 3:8, was preached to Abraham. It was preached to Abraham when God said, hey, through you, all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed. That's God preaching the gospel, this global blessing, that it unites believers. Now, it unites believers from different backgrounds, from different places, different contexts, with different experiences. It unites them to Jesus. And then in uniting them to Jesus, it unites them to one another. So there's much that can be said here, but in the early church, I mean, we see divisions, specifically between Jews and Gentiles. Even within the church, there's temptations to divide along those lines. So those who were ethnically dissimilar were tempted to break along those lines or pull back from one another. So the Jews over here, the Gentiles over here, naturally, because they bring lots of cultural things. There's a lot of cultural baggage that kind of comes with that. But in the very person of Jesus, things are different. So we see in the person of Jesus, as Paul says in Ephesians 2:14, he says that he himself is our peace. And he unites Jews and Gentiles. He breaks down the dividing wall that was once there. That in breaking down the dividing wall, he makes one new man. So the gospel is central to reconciliation. We can affect reconciliation at a human level, and we're thankful to see that where it can happen, where men can live together in peace. But it's ultimately the gospel that does that. Now, though the gospel is the means by which people can be reconciled ultimately to God, but to one another, doesn't erase the reality of particular challenges that Christians face when we're engaging issues of racial unity and reconciliation. And the importance of this for pro-life ministry is profound. I mean, so one example, you think if you're sidewalk counseling at an abortion clinic and you're from a predominantly white church, and you're talking to an African-American couple who says, we believe you. We think there's something to this Jesus thing, and we think life is important. You've convinced us. Take us to your church. You have moved from being part of the pro-life in a narrow sense on abortion. That's not the issue anymore. Now you've entered into, among other things, the conversation of racial reconciliation. And to make them truly feel welcomed, you have to think through some things. Is our church conducive for people from a different background to feel welcomed here? Do they feel represented and heard here? What experiences do they have that will be part of the natural discipleship process? So if they're following Jesus, I mean, it's almost a cross-cultural kind of discipleship. And I think we need to think about it that way. So it can't be, if that's when you're starting to think about it, when someone says yes, then I think you're thinking about it way too late. But if you think of pro-life from, abortion to end-of-life issues and everything in between, as the Bible presents a whole life pro-life ethic, then you'll be better equipped for those kind of things. And I think one practical way you can do that is to humbly listen, to listen to particularly those that are not like you, to listen humbly, not listen so you can formulate an argument or throw down a hot take on social media, but to genuinely listen and pray for God to help you, to listen to stories. I mean, I've heard enough heartbreaking stories of people who've been pulled over for looking suspicious in their own neighborhood, to know, man, there's something beyond coincidence going on there. So to listen to those and to think, how can our church be a welcoming refuge with gospel hope for all people? I think that's an important thing.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. King. We're running out of time, but just wanted to reiterate thanks for being involved tonight, but then also just all